I'm on a little bit earlier now because Gav has finished his lockdown radio show, so he can put Violet to bed and he can go to her if she wakes up, which is great. So, today I'm going to be talking about the different forms of stress and therefore the different ways to release them. And you've heard me touch on it just as I'm talking about other issues, but I wanted to dedicate a whole session to just talking about stress, emotions, and discharge. So, again, if you haven't heard the other ones, the reason I go through a lot of this work is for the people with chronic conditions where physical pain, illness, and disease, where they're not really getting answers. So, I always like to dig deeper into the emotions, the backstory, and try and connect people to the onset of their symptoms and what was going on in their life. So people will go into that logical ramble about what's happened to their body on a structural level, and I listen to them, I allow them that space. However, I then say, okay, well, what was going on in your life? Like, was there some big emotional event? Was there a death? Was there a divorce? Was there bullying? Whatever. And most of the time, people can relate to what's going on, but it can come across as a bit of a surprising question to them because they're not expecting someone to dig deeper. So, for the practitioners out there, I'm hoping to help you to encourage to dig deeper a little bit with your patients. And what I found is that most people want this. They want you to connect the dots, and that's when they feel like they've got a really holistic approach to their treatment. So, I'm just referencing my notes on the side here. So, there's the different types of stress. I categorize it into three main types and therefore three main types of release. So, three main types of stress are physical, physiological, and mental emotional. So, examples of physical stress would be the person who overtrains. We live in Wanaka, there's some amazing athletes here and really physical people, but I do know quite a few of them who have burnt themselves out from the physical action of overtraining. It could be just a job that is really physical and you don't get adequate rest. Um, and yeah, so that's physical. Then physiological can be things like getting viruses, so getting exposed but being run down and getting sick all the time. Physiological stress can also be your environment, so the climate and things like mold, toxins, exposure to that sort of thing. Some people would say a vaccine as well can be physiological stress, and I have touched on this in the past. I'm not pro or anti-vaccine. However, I do know a few people who have commented that they feel like the onset of their autoimmune conditions or other things have been triggered by things like a vaccine. So I'm just being very open about the things that have been shared with me in clinic. Mental and emotional stress are things like going through bullying, grief, divorce is a big one, and just that relationship emotional stress, just anger, stored anger, those kind of things. So just all the human emotions. And it's really important to understand most people have a very negative connotation to stress. However, stress is a positive part of life and it can drive some of us. I know that I am motivated by stress. And the important thing is that you don't allow it to go on long periods of time. You don't allow it to become chronic. So again, I talk about feminine and masculine energy, and stress is the masculine. The rest is the feminine aspect. So we can always go up, but we need to be able to come back down again. So, like the physical stress of training, and some of you have worked out or gone for a massive hike and maybe you haven't been fit for it, you're exhausted afterwards and your body tells you to rest. And if you listen to it, great, your muscles repair, you build, you grow. But if you don't listen to it and you just constantly train, you stress out your hormones, your body adapts. Maybe if you're female, you lose your period, and then the body starts to wear down, and you might get those physical injuries that happen all the time. So, stress can be relieved if we allow that space for it. So, whenever you get into that state of stress. So again, grief, when someone dies, is a part of the process. It's a stress. If you allow space for it, then you can usually discharge it and not store it in your body. So I'm all about teaching people that emotional awareness, so they don't store new emotions in their body, and they can start to uncover the old emotions that they need to shift. So allow space for them to come to the surface and be dealt with. But if we keep on bringing more stress into our life, then we don't get to acknowledge it. And part of that is getting into the masculine energy, being busy, being distracted, and that your emotional traumas become an inconvenience that you don't want to deal with. So the response to trauma. So response to trauma can be varied depending on the person, the issue. It's all very subjective. And usually the response would be the fight and flight, which is that sympathetic stress response. You take action, blood goes to your limbs, you run away, or you fight. The other response can be immobility. So an example, I'll go into this a little bit more, is that you watch it in the movies and you're just like behind that person, you're like, my God, just run. But that person is immobilized and you get so frustrated by it because it's like, why did they not escape? So who knows why that happens? There's probably an explanation behind it, but I won't go into it just yet. Now I'm going to use some examples, which is from a really great book by a guy called Peter Levine. And it's called Waking the Tiger, and he talks a lot about trauma at the very high level, so rape victims, war victims, and the process, and he talks about this discharging, which is really cool. I'm listening to it on Audible. I listened to it on 1.5 times speed because the guy is really slow with his talking. So let's go into the animal response. So this is just to help you get an idea of the fight and flight versus immobility and how an animal responds to it, because usually they don't develop a lot of emotional traumas. Some people would argue that, because like with dogs and horses and things like that. However, so we all know that fight and flight analogy of the gazelle, the little animal getting chased by the lion, and it will run away, and then because of that, it goes through a period of shaking. All that adrenaline gets discharged and it shakes. And it might have so that's a physical discharge. It might have a physiological discharge where it poos and it pees and it sweats. And then discharges it, and then it goes on its merry way. The other thing that can happen is that when an animal's under real threat and it doesn't get to escape, is that it becomes immobilized and everything in its body just shuts down. And that's a survival mechanism, because the predator then just goes, well, this prey is no good. Like, it's not alive, and it's unhealthy, so I'm not going to attack it. So immobility is a protective mechanism, but usually what happens is there is that period of discharge. So this is something that I try and help people facilitate in the treatment, especially when there's that chronic stored stress and deep emotion. So if we take it to the so I'm going to use another example, is like a bird, and this is the example that he uses in the book, a bird that crashes into the windscreen, or we've all had birds crash into our window, and then it kind of gets dazed, knocked out, and it's on the ground. And we usually know just to leave it alone and give it space, and it will slowly come to, it'll flap around, it'll be a bit disorientated, and then it regains its sense of balance and awareness, and then it flies off and it's fine. That bird doesn't store trauma around flying into a window. It's done. But what happens is, say if you go and pick that animal up, it's great if you can provide safety, protection for it. But if you see it starting to shake and you're like, oh no, poor thing, and you pet it, you're actually suppressing that ability for it to physically discharge. And he says in the book that each time you suppress it, each time it tries to discharge, that process takes longer and longer. And then the bird ends up actually dying from overwhelm and fright. So this is where I talk about the ability for practitioners to engage with a practitioner or be the practitioner that can hold space for someone to emotionally release. So if someone needs to cry, I say, look, there's tissues there if you want them, but it's actually good to cry. I don't offer them the tissues because for me, that shows that I'm uncomfortable dealing with the emotion, and it makes someone feel like, oh my gosh, I should be wiping away these tears. But actually, you just need to let it out. The snot and everything that comes out with it as well. Uh, and yeah, during the process of treatment as well, if someone is laughing their head off, you can tell it's a different kind of laugh that they just need to discharge. And again, it's creating that safe space where someone feels protected, um, safe, warm, all those basic human needs to allow that to happen. So what's the other thing? So yesterday I talked a bit about how I needle people. Some people do it through manipulation or cracking, or it can just be gentle through soft tissue massage or cranial work. Is that you can get the twitches, the shaking, and people kind of freak out. But if you encourage them to say, look, it's that emotion discharging from the body, allow it to happen. They're like, oh, okay, I've never allowed it to happen. Let me do this now. And then they might get the sweats, and then after the treatment they might get the pees, the poos. I've had people feel like they've had flu symptoms for 24 hours or vomited after. So usually I say, so vomiting and all those sweats and everything is the physiological discharge. And I usually say when you're vomiting, it's because there is a more recent trauma that's sitting there. Um, Whereas the poos, the diarrhea, and the purge from the other end is usually that old stored stuff. So things like constipation is usually holding on and not wanting to let go. So I usually give people a heads up that, hey, you might have just a really strange experience tonight. You might feel sick, you might go to the toilet, you might vomit, but just let it come up. Don't hold it in your body because we're giving your body that opportunity to release. And emotional discharge is just things like the laughter, the screaming, and the crying. And what's really interesting, so when I did my psychosomatic training with Chris Knight and Jody many years ago, is there was a bodywork component where we would learn how to release the body. And if you were walking outside, you would think people were being murdered in that room. The sounds that were coming out, I couldn't tell who was who. There was singing, there was crying, there was vomiting, and there was really primal screaming. And it was a really nice space to be in because we had all been prepped for it. We were all ready to release. And yeah, it was incredible. So it's a lot of the time that people aren't comfortable with that level of letting things go. And even in my treatment room, there are some people who are like, oh, I'm just worried that people out in the waiting room are going to hear me. However, for most of us that work there, we've created that space where there is a level of satisfaction when you hear something go off in a room. All right, so those are the different forms of discharge: physical, physiological, and emotional, and therefore that's also the forms of stress that can cause it. So you can bring the stress on as long as you let it go the other end. Now, the things that we will often do as humans is we will suppress. So different forms of suppression can be eating the food because we feel uncomfortable, we distract ourselves, go to the pantry a million times, maybe stuff our faces with food that doesn't make us feel great. We distract ourselves, we procrastinate, we throw ourselves into a project and get really busy. So particularly the people with grief go, I like being back at work, I want to be busy, I want to be distracted. They will usually come around and they will deal with it in their own time, but some people don't deal with grief for many, many years. And it manifests in the body. Substance abuse, so alcohol is really common. I live in New Zealand, no offense to Kiwis, but I do find there is a really weird culture around drinking and how much is normal. And yeah, the level of normal is quite high. So substance abuse can be smoking dope, taking drugs, taking heroin, anything that suppresses and takes that feeling away because it's uncomfortable. Emotions can be uncomfortable to deal with. Medication is the other one. So I use anxiety as a example, and Again, I'm not against conventional medicine. It is quite necessary during particular times, especially if someone is quite traumatized or in pain. They need something to help give them clarity to start to move forwards. But I always say with certain medications like anti-anxiety, depression, or even pain medication, is look at it to use it in the short term. And short term could be a month or it could be 6 months, especially for the sort of mental medication. But then use that opportunity to take stock of what's going on and work out a plan on how you're going to move forwards on it. Don't rely on these medications long term, because particularly with anti-anxiety medications, antidepressant medications, is that they just stabilize your mood. So you don't tend to react as much. And then you often have to deal with a weaning process as well and detoxifying your body when you come off that. And that's where you can get into that rebound of going, oh, I've got the dizzy spells, this is really uncomfortable, I'm going to just go back on the medication. So short-term use, if you have a plan to try and get out of it, and this is where you might use counselors and find that supportive network. So to be able to discharge on a healthy level, you do need to have that support network, whether it be practitioner or friends, a safe place, and quietness as well, so away from the distraction. So my next thing is, the short-term versus long-term suppression is look at suppressing things for a short term to help you navigate what your next steps are. So moving forwards this is all about prevention. So we don't want you from now on to be taking on any new emotions that can potentially cause physical dis-ease, discomfort, pain, or weakening areas in your body. So you want to allow space for the discharge. So for us at the moment, people are going to go back into work over the next couple of weeks, few weeks. There's lots going on with planning. It's been a stressful period for a lot of people. So it's important to allow yourself that downtime to recover from that mental stress or that organisation. And then anger discharge is something that I was talking about today, and I talked to a lot of people. Anger and frustration, it's come up a lot in our previous chats as well, so that's why I'll give some space for it today, is that when we feel anger in our body, it's often felt in particular areas of the body, and there's also been a study around this to show that different emotions are felt in different areas of the body, and it's quite consistent between people. Is that anger is quite healthy if it isn't allowed to build up. What happens is with any emotion, not just anger, is that it gets to a point where the body can compensate, it can deal with it until it can't anymore, and then you hit that emergency release button and it comes out in a harmful way. It may be inappropriate words, it may be physical, it might hurt yourself, it might hurt other people. That's when it becomes harmful. But if we learn to recognize anger or situations that make us angry, irritated, frustrated, and discharge that early, then it doesn't get to that point of blowing your top. So I recommend to people is, if you imagine that situation that makes you angry, what is it that you would want to do if you got to that end result? And find a safe space to discharge that. So remember, there's the physical aspect. Usually there's a breath and there's a sound. And this is a process that I was taught myself. And so I usually tell people like what I do and what I encourage them to do as a start is to go and drive in their car and scream in their car, and do it every single day. It only takes 20 seconds to let out a big scream. And then over time, usually you find, gosh, even if I do my drive to work and I let out a scream, is that you actually don't have the energy there anymore. And that's not the time to stop. That's the time to go, right, I don't need to do it every day. Maybe I just need to do it a few times a week. So don't think things are good and otherwise things just build up again. Facilitating the release. So that is one way you can do it at home without any help. Sadness, you do the same thing. Go have your cry, and people think, oh my gosh, you're just like letting that person be in that sorry state that's really harming them. But it's all about cleaning up the mess. Emotions are messy. Get them, deal with them, get them out of the way. And depending on how deeply buried they are, it may take longer to go through that process. But sometimes it can be alleviated significantly within a few days, a few weeks, maybe it is months. And if you are unsure, it is always good to seek out help from a practitioner to get support and guidance, because some of us are really gung-ho and we just go for it and do too much, and others just are unsure about the next step. So this is where you can also see a therapist to help facilitate that release. And some people like the gentle approach and other people like that strong approach. But it's important that you connect with a therapist where you feel like you've got that connection and that trust and supportive environment to let your emotions go. All right, so hi Bronte, how are you? And Andrew and Kevin. So, sorry, I don't seem to see the comments pop up until I click on them. Anyway, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into stress, emotions, and preventing. Let's start having a preventative approach about not causing more issues in our body and fixing them, because that's far more expensive and takes a lot more time than just starting to become more aware. Anyway, another long one. Tell me if you prefer short or long lives and anything else that you want to learn about. All right, have a great night. See you later.